This is the week we conclude The Republic, which should be really exciting for you. It is exciting for me. The reason it's exciting is because it's a big accomplishment. You finish it pretty quickly. And I also hope that you kind of realize why reading the symposium before The Republic was so significant. I always worry that there's a lot that we miss if we don't have in-class discussion on The Republic, because there's a lot in that text. And so I kind of want you just throughout the semester to hold on to the things that have caught your attention in The Republic and to kind of remember significant points of it, because I think you'll see the questions return over and over again. And then you can start to see the other texts we read as being in dialogue with Plato, which I think they are. So let's talk a little bit about the structure of the end here. When we left off last time, what we were dealing with was a sort of building of the city in speech that I told you mapped onto the human soul. Then we went through the three waves and kind of what the three waves are supposed to signify about the challenges that politics faces, or that we face when we engage in politics. Now you know the city in speech is constructed, you've heard the details of the three waves, and you're left in this spot where now you have to get the payoff, right? And the payoff is going to be the response to Thrasymachus. What is justice? Why is it better to be just than unjust? Why is doing what is just both good in itself and good for its benefits? This is where we are. And the way that Plato unpacks that is to go through the regime deterioration cycle with you. The regime deterioration cycle is very important. And then once he's done with that, you still have, some text left. And what I think is the regime cycle seems to me to be an attempt to answer why being just is beneficial and why being unjust will make you unhappy. The idea that you would be made happy by doing justice, truly happy by doing justice, which is the next part of what has to be said, is gonna come to us in book 10 in the Myth of Ur. I'm sorry. Yeah, no, wait. I said the wrong one, I think. No, I think it is the Myth of Ur. I get confused because there are a lot of myths, but the myth and the person who comes back from the dead. So what my plan is for us to go ahead and take the Myth of Ur as a separate step from the regime deterioration cycle. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and make a first part of our inquiry be on the combination of books 8 and 9. And then I'm going to handle the Myth of Ur separately. So books 8 through 9 are about a regime deterioration cycle. And Plato seems to think that the cycle could occur in a number of different ways. It doesn't necessarily always have to be the descent from aristocracy, monarchy, to democracy, to oligarchy, to democracy, to tyranny. But this is one possible way it can happen. I'd also point out to you that this deterioration is a descent that I think is based around the worst order of loves. Okay, if you'll notice, Plato tells you what each regime loves. It's better to love honor, in his opinion, than it is to love money. Okay, even if both are mistaken objects of love. And in the degeneration cycle, of course, it's descent. It's going down. Remember that in the symposium, what you have is an ascent of the loves, right? From the less authentic form of love to more authentic form of love. So I just wanted to bring that up. Pay special attention to the way that the deterioration starts. The deterioration starts because nobody makes a mistake, right? A moral mistake. Nobody, for example, decides that they're gonna stop defending the city, or stop sharing things in common, or consume more goods. That's not the way everything gets off track. The way everything gets off of track actually has something to do with our very limited knowledge as humans, right? And it seems like this way of getting off track was inevitable, right? What happens? The philosopher kings guess the wrong nuptial number. And remember what the nuptial number was. It's the number that you use to match people up with each other and mate them together to breed the different kinds of people that you need for the regime. So the deterioration cycle starts not because of a moral error, but because of an intellectual error. And this intellectual error is made by those humans who have the greatest intellectual capacity. And what I think this should tell you right away is that what Plato is telling you is that there is a limit to what the human mind can do. Okay, there is a limit to our wisdom. There is therefore going to be a certain amount of imperfection in anything that we undertake. Just as a matter of course. Why is this important? Because I think it goes with my earlier thesis that he's not serious about the three waves. He's not really saying to do all these tyrannical things like take your children away or make you have sex with somebody you don't care for. What he's saying is that there's a sort of impossibility of a perfection of politics, right, and justice there. And then when it comes to our wisdom, even for doing philosophy, right, and politics and philosophy have a relation for each other for him, we are not perfect there either. Okay. I'd also point out to you that each stage in the deterioration is really best understood as a descent from higher sort of love to a lower sort of love. Okay, so the philosopher king, which it's kind of like an aristocracy, you might say, because there seem to be multiple philosopher kings. They love the good. They love the just. Okay, and what happens is, once the nuptial number is guessed wrong, the type of person produced to lead the city is not the kind of person who would make a good philosopher king, okay? And what you have then is a transition of power from what were the philosopher kings who were very wise to the auxiliaries, the guardians, who were engaged in combat and defending the city. And what they love is honor. Okay? Loving honor, he says, is not as bad as it can get. Because at this stage in the regime, there's still some connection between doing the right thing and honor. Okay? In order to get honor, the timocrat will do certain things, will not do certain things to achieve honor, right? However, it's not enough. For one reason, which is that having honor doesn't always mean being just. You can be honored for the wrong things. It also means maybe not thinking too much about what your society thinks of as honorable. Maybe there's a mistake in your society about what that is, and you don't question it. You accept it because you want the honor. It's still better, though, because it's associated with some kind of good and some sort of striving for the good. Now, if you'll notice, Plato says that the movement from the Timocrat to the oligarch is one that is occasioned by the son of the Timocrat seeing what happens to his father. I think this is really important. And if you go through and you reread the cycle, what you're going to see, I think, is that there is a mention of the family at each stage of deterioration. Something different happens in the character of the son versus the character of the father. And something different also happens in the relationship of the citizens between each other. So, to give an example of what I'm talking about, when you move from democracy to oligarchy, the reason this happens is because the son of the Timocrat sees his father spend his life in service of the city for the sake of what? For the sake of being praised, right? Is honorable. And this is what motivates him. This is what he wants. This is what's enough for him. But let's say that that honor starts to lose its foundation and they're honored less. Or let's say that they're honored, but they're not compensated by financial things. Okay, so the son looks at the father and thinks, you're a sucker. You know, you did all this for the regime. You were always doing these public works. Public works don't get you private money. And Plato says that the mother, and of course this is misogynistic, but that's what we're dealing with. The mother is always nagging the father, you do this for the city, you do that for the city, right? You know, why do you do that? You didn't buy us this, you didn't buy us that, so-and-so has this, so-and-so has that, okay? And the son sees that and says, yeah, I guess, the city doesn't value my father, my mom doesn't value my father. What we really need here is money, right? Money is the thing that gets people's respect, and it's the thing that helps you to live a happy life, okay? So there's something like that in each section. There's also a change in between the ruling part of the soul, right? So the first step in deterioration, of course, is not just. You're moving further away from justice. So you move from the rational part of the soul ruling and the rational part of the city ruling to what? The thumonic part, okay? And that means that the city and the soul are now out of order, which means they're unjust. But they're less unjust than the movement from love of the good to love of money, okay? They're less unjust than that because money is an inferior love, and it's tied to a lower part of the soul, the appetite. Instead of moving from reason to thumos ruling, you are moving from reason to thumos to appetite. Okay, and Plato goes on to divide the appetites further, right? You have necessary appetites, which are the appetites of the oligarch, and then you have unnecessary appetites, which are going to be what drive the Democrat. And then you're going to have the division of the unnecessary appetites into the unnecessary appetites and like the unspeakable appetites, which are the appetites of the tyrant. So the effect of all of this is to say, just watch the movement carefully. And also as you're looking, right, you need to note, this is a deterioration of a city, but he always tells you, this is the descent of the Timocratic man. This is the descent of the Timocratic city. And so again, you have this pairing of the city and the soul, and they're deteriorating in the same way, and they're mapping onto each other, right? That's important. So to focus briefly on the second half of the regime deterioration cycle, I'll just point out a few things about the democrat and the tyrant, right? And those kinds of regimes. Now, note that Plato says that the democratic regime, which loves freedom the most of all, loves freedom to be able to decide what you want to do, right? It's freedom for the sake of freedom, basically, not to be able to make decisions between better and worse. There's no interest in that. It's about that kind of self-determination. Now, the preceding story is that the oligarch has the common man in his regime fight a war to make money for the oligarch. But because the oligarch is not like the democrat, with this kind of self-disciplined, other-oriented honor, the oligarch does not know how to wage war. And he doesn't know, I guess, sort of how to get his hands dirty. He knows how to pay people to get their hands dirty for them. So what the democrat starts to notice is that the oligarch sends them to war, maybe oversees them in war, but that they, the democrat, are more skilled. They seem to have more virtue, more bravery, okay? And so they start to question, why is this oligarch ruling me? It seems to be the case the oligarch is ruling me because they have money, right? And what does that have to do with anything? Why does that give them any ability to be able to judge between good and bad, okay? So that is the kind of vulnerability there. Now, in the democratic regime, Plato says, this is the regime that is could be most friendly to philosophy, other than the philosopher king one. Why? Because you have your freedom. And remember, Athens was a democracy. Athens killed Socrates, right? But for a while, philosophy was thriving there. So, if you want to go and sit down and study philosophy together, you can. Nobody cares because you can do whatever you want. Okay, so there's a certain kind of benefit there. But what Plato says happens in the democratic regime is because there's no standards of judgment, there's no way of deciding better or worse. They cannot make just policy or organize the city in a just way. And they themselves can't discern between their good and bad appetites, or their wise appetites or unwise appetites. And what ends up happening is that you have this crisis moment where nobody can rule. Everything's in disorder, no one agrees. And this is the step into tyranny, when a strong man comes along and says, look, you guys have gotten things out of order. It's very difficult. We're in a panicked moment. Hand over your freedom to me and I will align things. I will reorder things. And I'll clean up this mess that we've made. And that's how the tyrant comes into being, right? Almost through this false sense of security. Now, one of the first things you hear about the tyrant, which goes back to my point about family and friends in each regime, is that the tyrant kills his father, okay? The tyrant kills his father and his mother, which in Greek society, this goes back to what I was telling you about the waves. And actually for most of ancient and medieval political thought, something like patricide would just, or fratricide, matricide, any of those would be an unspeakable kind of injustice, because it is the most fundamental tie that you have is to your family, and if you murder them, it's seen as just completely evil. So the tyrant does this thing, right? One of the first things he does is his most unnatural act. Killing his own father and mother. It ends up being the case that he doesn't have friends, because the friends that he does have, who are true friends, who try to help him, he begins to suspect, he doesn't trust, and he kills them. Or the people that are near to him are people who just tell him what he wants to hear and do his bidding. And they're not really his friends, they're just his flatterers. I always think here of Elvis Presley. It's really sad. You know, one of the reasons Elvis died, he had all these really bad addictions, and his doctor just kept prescribing him drugs, and he ate really unhealthily. But he had this big entourage, and anyone who was in that entourage who would not agree or enable his addiction was out. And the people who managed to stay in were the people who wanted him to continue to kind of be out of his mind, so they could influence him in different ways and take money from him. Okay, that's the kind of thing. There's been allegations, right, that this is what's happening with Demi Lovato when she fell off the wagon about a year ago or 6 months ago. So the tyrant doesn't have real friends. The tyrant destroys the real friends he has, and the tyrant destroys his own family. That sounds pretty miserable, okay? And then it turns out to be the case that the tyrant is terrorized by his own desires. Plato says the life is a waking nightmare. Why is this? It seems it has something to do with the tyrant's conscience, though conscience is not really an idea that's in Plato or in Aristotle. He seems to say that the tyrant's life is a waking nightmare because he remembers every injustice he's done. He's not able to commit injustice without remembering what he's done. So he gives into his appetites, right? And his appetites are the lowest and darkest form. But in a way, even while he satisfies them, he destroys them himself. I mean, his soul. So an example I like to give here is there's a story, a famous murder case that occurred like 10 or 15 years ago, and the man burned alive the family. I think he killed the father first, but he tied the mother and two young daughters. I think one was like 12 and one was like 14. After raping them, he tied them to their beds, and then he set the house on fire. And you know, eventually he did that with a partner. Eventually he's caught and they're sentenced to death. But at a certain point, their lawyers get a stay of the death penalty in their case. And this person who did this starts to say, I want you to give me the death penalty. Stop fighting for me not to be executed. Why? Because every time he was asleep, he had dreams about burning these people alive that he had raped. And when he was awake, he remembered his dreams. There was no escape. And so he said, my life is hell. I just want to be dead so that I can't be alive to remember this. And that's the kind of thing that Plato's talking about here. The tyrant is not happy. He's miserable. And also the tyrant's not in control, right? It seems a tyrant has all the power, right? Because they have total control of the laws. Nothing stopping what they say from going in the regime. There's no distinction between what they want and what the regime does. But this actually turns out to make him not a strong person, but a very weak person, because he cannot say no to any of his desires. Okay, he Plato says, is a slave to his desires. So he seems like the most free, but paradoxically, he's not. And this is where that example that Plato gives of the man that is part man, part lion, part beast comes in. It's like you feed the part of yourself you feed more is the part that will guide you. Okay, so if you feed your love of justice, your love of reason, right, more, then that part of you will be stronger. if you feed your necessary appetites more, that part of you will be stronger. If you feed your love of freedom, a necessary appetite more, that part becomes stronger. And lastly, if you're the tyrant and you feed the tyrannical dark part of your soul, that part becomes the dominant part. Okay, so that is kind of how all of that wraps up. The kind of thing I want to point out to you is significant is what I kind of just laid out for you here. And now we're going to just go briefly to the myth of Ur. Okay. So this is our last part. Our, kind of ta-da! And people will say about the Republic that the end of the Republic is just a deus ex machina. It's just a god out of the machine. Plato couldn't do it. He couldn't pull it off. He couldn't tell you why it was better to be just than unjust. For its own sake. Because it would make you happy. The happiest. Okay? I don't think that's the case. And the reason I don't think that's the case is because I think there's a lot more going on in the myth of Ur than just a sort of story of, well, then God's going to come along and make everybody happy, and so I don't have to explain anything. Okay. So what do I think is going on in the myth of Ur? Remember that myth for Plato does not mean lie. He makes a distinction between myth that is pernicious because it doesn't participate in what's true, and myth that you could call true, meaning that it's a way of capturing something that's true but that's accessible. Like if I want to talk to my daughter about someone who could hurt her, right? If there are people in the world who want to hurt you and that you have to be careful, I could tell her, there are people in the world who are wanting to hurt you and you have to be careful. They want to kill you or assault you or whatever, right? But maybe that's too much when you're 4 or 5. And maybe I can use something like a fairy tale, like Hansel and Gretel, where there is the threat of death, right? Where there is the threat of kidnapping, but it's couched in this story. Maybe I can tell her that, and that is would be a true myth, right? That would be a good myth. So the myth of Ur, I think, is that kind of myth. It's not a lie in the sense that it's a story, oh, God's going to come in and make everything okay. For their philosophical reasons that Plato thinks that this is true in some sense. But they're not reasons that we're going to necessarily understand outside of myth. So I see that my video froze. Okay, it looks like it's back now. I feel like we're on a good flow, so I'm going to keep going. What I want you to pay attention to is this idea of necessity. Who is the goddess that kind of opens the door and gives the lives, right? The goddess that does that is Lachesis, who is necessity. Okay, not Lechusa. If you know who Lechusa is, then you'll think that's funny. But Lachesis opens the lives, right? And then it's this weird combination of chance and virtue, okay, is what it comes down to. That is what that myth is about. So, yes, okay, there is a lot, meaning some of us are going to get to pick a life earlier than somebody else. So there's some part of this that's outside of our control. The cards were dealt outside of our control. Okay, but what seems to be inside control of the person here, according to Ur, who's recounting this myth, What's in control is your ability to choose from the lives when your turn comes. And so it's important, and you should think about this, that the first person who gets to choose their life, according to the dialogue, is somebody who's been raised in the best kind of regime. Okay, they have had everything. They should know what justice is. Okay, they should know what life is the best life for them to pick to be reincarnated as. They don't. Okay, they don't know that. This means that even given, right, the best life that they could have on earth and all the opportunities to learn, they didn't take it. Okay? So even though they got this good fortune, they didn't have the necessary virtue for it. And I'll just kind of say, I think that this is kind of capturing the way that our life circumstances are out of our control to a great extent. But what we can control is what we learn about from that and how that shapes our character. So, for example, Odysseus in the myth chooses the life of a private man. And this is really cool because why? It's an undoing of these old myths that Plato kind of really, wants to kill in the beginning of the Republic. By making Odysseus a different kind of hero who desires a different kind of life, not this life of longing and traveling and tricking people. Okay, but the life of a private man. What can a private man do for Plato? Philosophy, okay? Or maybe you want to say a private man might be able to just attend to his community, like Socrates did, right, outside of political institutions, and he could gather people around him and talk and just have friends, right? So this great adventurer learns from his adventuring that what he really longs for is a life where he can be just, where he has more of a shot at being just. And I think that's really neat. So I'd encourage you to think about that more and, push back. If you don't think that's what's going on in this myth, that's fine. We can talk about it. The one thing that I would add is that I think that the way that we're talking about a myth, right? And that this myth has something to do with the eternal soul. We didn't get a chance to read the Apology, but it seems pretty clear to me that in that text, Plato Socrates thinks the soul is immortal, and that the soul that does the good, right, is rewarded by the good, or at worst, just has an eternal sleep. But he does seem to think that we have an immortal soul, and he thinks you can know this philosophically. It's interesting, a lot of the things we think of as being claims that are theological, for the ancients are just metaphysical. And so he seems to think by reason, we have a good reason to think the soul is immortal, okay? And so then, if that's the case, then something like the myth of I think, is capturing that insight for us, but in a way that even the non-philosopher could understand. Okay, with that, I kind of leave you to your work, and we'll be starting on Aristotle soon. Thank you. Bye.